Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be in Habakkuk chapters 1 and 2, where we hear questions before the Lord. In the Old Testament, God regularly had a priest who served as a mediary and intermediate between the people and God. The priest would come into the presence of God representing the people. But there was another sort of intermediary that God would use, and that was the prophet. The prophet would go in the opposite direction. He would come from the Lord, and he would represent God to the people. When we come to the book of Habakkuk, especially in the first two chapters, we see Habakkuk. He's going to be a prophet, but in a sense, he's actually going in both directions. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1, the oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. Notice we're not given a date, although I think we'll pick that up just from some of the names that are used. If you're reading something and it says George Washington walked in the room, you can sort of tell when that's taking place. The same thing is going to happen here in the case of Habakkuk. Verse 2, how long, O Lord, will I call for help and you will not hear? Notice the problem isn't that they'd been calling, but it seemed like God has gone on vacation. I've called for help and you will not hear. I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. There are problems that need help. There is violence that needs the judge to come and stop it. And yet it continues. Verse 3, why do you make me see, and this is the prophet speaking, why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me, strife exists, and contention arises. This book is going to be about the issue of theodicy. Now, that's a sort of a strange word. Theos is the word for God, and the DC part, the DK, is the Greek word for righteousness. And so God's righteousness is asking the question, why do bad things happen? And God doesn't stop it. Now, that question was addressed, at least in part, back in the book of Job. And in the book of Job, we looked at Job, and he was going through some bad things, and we sort of got a glimpse into heaven. This is going to be quite a bit different, because in this case, the bad things that are taking place are both among God's people and being carried out by God's people. So notice the question, why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Why don't you stop it, at least among the people of God? Verse 4, therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld, for the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. It's a terrible thing to go into the place where there ought to be justice, to go into court of law, to take something to the police, and to see justice perverted, and the police and the courts of law, instead of doing the right thing, where you see them doing the wrong thing. In his book Unexpected Wisdom, Dan Schmidt has this to say. He says, faith does not flourish very well in a five-star hotel. It develops better when there are challenges and where it is dark. And Habakkuk lives in a dark place and in a dark time. And he is going to learn a lesson of faith. So Habakkuk's question, why does God allow the wicked to go unpunished? And we're going to see God's answer. It's coming up in the next few verses where God says, I'm going to bring judgment, and we'll see what that judgment looks like. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 1, verse 5, look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder. Notice those short little command statements. Actually, in the Hebrew, they're one word, a number of them are. Because I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. Do you ever look at what's going on in your day and say, if I didn't see it with my own eyes, I would not have thought it took place. I remember back on 9/11 when the Twin Towers in Washington D.C. In New York City were brought down by the actions of a terrorist flying these jet airplanes into the towers. And I remember I'd heard about it on the radio, and actually I was up at the seminary when the news first came in, and didn't really pay that much attention. I didn't realize it was a terrorist plot at the time. I thought maybe it was just an accident. But then I heard more about it, and I got home, turned on the television, and remember a friend of mine, a young friend who's was part of our church, and our families had interacted over the years in discipleship sort of times. And he called me up, and we just sat there on the phone together, watching this unfold on live television. And I remember thinking there was a certain sense of unreality. It was like something in a bad science fiction movie, and yet it was really taking place. And notice he says, "You would not believe it if you were told I'm doing something." Verse 6, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs." Now, when he mentions the Chaldeans, that's a very specific group and a very specific king. There's a king of the Chaldeans that's on his way. In the generation before Habakkuk, the main superpower of the world had been Assyria with its capital in Nineveh. But now two new kings had arisen, one from Babylon, one from the Medes, and they had formed an alliance and converged on Nineveh, destroyed it in 612 BC. Now, this had all happened before Habakkuk's day. In the intervening period after this, the Medes turned around and they went back home, but Babylon continues to be a world force. The king of Babylon had been Nabopolassar, but he's getting on in years, and a few years later he dies, and Nebuchadnezzar, now his son, the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar, becomes King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar comes against Judah, had taken Judah in the year 605 BC, had subjugated it, and had made Judah sort of a vassal state. Judah's good king Josiah had died just a bit earlier. And now one of the sons of Josiah is on the throne as a puppet to Nebuchadnezzar, but he's going to do evil. In fact, all of the sons of Josiah, and several of them are going to reign, and they all are going to do evil and not walk in the way of the Lord. And as a result, Judah is going to be destroyed. That's still in the future. The destruction of Judah is still in the future. The temple is going to be destroyed. Jerusalem will be with its walls torn down. That hasn't happened yet, but Babylon is coming, and that's exactly what Habakkuk is going to see. Verse 7, these Chaldeans, they are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. After all, they had brought down the Assyrians, who were fierce enough on their own. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. It's far away from Mesopotamia. They fly like an eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. We're going to see violence again mentioned, so just sort of note that term. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. They are an unstoppable force coming down into the land. Verse 11, then they will sweep on through like the wind and pass on. They're not going to stop at Judah. They're actually going to go all the way to Egypt. But they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. And notice this reference to idolatry, because that's going to come up again as well. They are idol worshipers, but also they're worshiping their own strength. The first problem then that Habakkuk had dealt with is, why does God allow the wickedness to continue? And he was speaking of wickedness in the land of Judah, the wickedness among those who were supposed to be God's people. And the answer is that God is going to bring judgment against that. He's going to put a stop to it. That brings up a second problem. How can God use the wicked to do his will? How can God use the wicked to bring about that punishment? It would seem like the punishment is worse than the disease. The cure is worse than the initial problem. Verse 12, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? Notice God is holy, but wait a second. If you're using an unholy tool, How can a holy God use an unholy tool? Notice he says, we will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O rock, have established them to correct. He gets what he gets what God is saying. That God is going to use Babylon as his tool. But this brings up the question, yes, God is sovereign, God can do that, but how is that just? How is that right? How does that marriage between God's sovereignty and God's justice take place? These two seem to be in tension. Verse 13, your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. So if that's the case, why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you, it looks like you're actually blessing Babylon. You're allowing them to come and conquer and to pillage and to do all these bad things and to plunder. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Second question, why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Yes, Judah has sinned, but Babylon's much worse because they're pagans and they're sinning. A third why, although the translators have added this one, why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them? You're just allowing evil to just flourish. Verse 15, he's still speaking of the Chaldeans who bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Verse 16, therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net. Notice they're idol worshippers. They're, they're worshiping both pagan gods and their own strength. And it's sort of a marriage here with this reference to a sacrifice to their net. And burn incense to their fishing net, saying the same thing. This is poetical speech, just saying the same thing with two different lines. Because through these things their catch is large and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? God, how can you allow that? So we've seen the initial problem was, why does God allow the wicked? And the answer was that God would bring judgment. Then that led to the second problem, how can God use the wicked to punish? But the second answer now is that God's also going to judge them. He will eventually balance the books, not just for God's people, but for all people. We see that beginning in chapter 2, verse 1, although these first 5 verses are something of a transition. He says, I will stand on my guard posts and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me. Habakkuk has posed the question. Now he's ready for the answer. He's waiting for it, and how I may reply when I am reproved. After all, when he's asking the question, remember, he's representing the people. They're going to be asking him, and he wants to have an answer. And so he's waiting for the answer from God. Verse 2, then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets. You see, this isn't just going to be a spoken word, this is going to be a written word. And when you write something, and not just write it, they're going to write it on tablets. We have an expression sometimes we say it's written in stone, and when we say that, we mean that it is permanent. You can sort of bank on it, and that's what we have here. Record the vision, inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. Verse 3, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. So you see, sometimes you have conditional promises, and sometimes you have promises you can't tell if it's conditional or not because the condition isn't specifically stated, but it's still conditional. But this is much stronger. This is written in stone. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail, though it tarries. Wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. This is a confirmed prediction. Verse 4, behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. That's speaking of the Chaldeans, of Nebuchadnezzar, of those who were lifted up in their pride. But, and I think we have here a conjunction of contrast, in contrast to the proud one, in contrast to the one whose soul is not right within him, the righteous will live by his faith. Notice this is the place where the tension meets. The proud one, that's Nebuchadnezzar, but the one who lives by his faith, that's the one who finds the answer. That's the one who finds life. And this is in the midst of a prophecy about death and destruction. And yet the righteous will live by his faith. This is going to be a passage that's going to be quoted a number of times in the New Testament because it sets forth this idea that the righteous don't just live by being righteous, by being righteous. The righteous live by faith. In fact, it's through faith that we apprehend that righteousness. It's for us, it's our faith in Christ, the Messiah, the one that was promised from the Old Testament. As we trust in him, he not only gives righteousness, he becomes our righteousness, so that we are declared to be righteous on the basis of who he is. Now, we move from here into 5 woes of judgment. And in verse 6, it starts off, woe to him who increases what is not his. Verse 9, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house to put his nest on high. Verse 12, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Verse 15, woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk so as to look on their nakedness. And finally, verse 19, woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. Notice how some of those themes we already saw at the end of chapter 1. But as we read this list, the question comes up, wait a minute, are we still talking about Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, or are these woes also against the people who were supposed to be the people of God, but judging from the way Habakkuk began his book, had not been acting the part? You see, I have perhaps a double application here. Now, that brings up the question, against whom are these woes directed? Are they against Babylon? Are they against the people of Judah? And the answer is yes. If the shoe fits, wear it. And so we look at each one of these. The one who increases what is not his. And yes, Babylon was doing that. But that was seen also among the Jews, the people of Judah. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house to put his nest on high. The people of Judah were engaging in the same sort of things. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. They had done that. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix your venom even to make them drunk so as to look on their nakedness, that engaged in all sorts of wrong activity. And woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. Even the people of God had engaged in idolatry. Both the scriptures and even archaeology bear this out, that this was often the case among the people of Judah. In, again, Dan Schmidt, I want to give you this quote as well. He says, we assume God to be predictable, and so we take liberties with him. We forget that while he is personal, he is not pocket-sized. The way C.S. Lewis put it in his Chronicles of Narnia, he is not a safe lion. He is the God of all creation, and he is big, and he is dangerous, and at times he is unpredictable, but he is also good. In verse 14, there's an interesting caveat, where in the midst of these woes, the prophet says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, when you talk about the earth will be filled, you can refer to, in a localized sense, the land, and that works too. But I think it's much bigger than that. How that which began in Judah, God speaking to his people through Abraham and bringing them into the promised land and calling them to be a special people, that's going to overflow and fill not just the land of Judah. In fact, the land of Judah is going to be scattered. And with that scattering will take place another scattering, a scattering that involves the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. It happens again, in a sense, not through a captivity, but when we get to the New Testament. There's another scattering that takes place, a scattering, again, of persecution, a scattering where bad things take place. And in that scattering, out goes the gospel. And today, here we are. I live in South Florida, and I live in a day and an age where the earth has been filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. I can go anywhere in the world today, and I can find people that believe in the Lord and are called according to his purpose. I'm not saying every single person out there believes. That's not the case. But I can find Christians in every corner of the world as the waters cover the sea. All right, just to sum up what we've seen so far, and this is Dave Dorsey's outline in his neat little book about literary structures. The question that we saw back in chapter 1, verse 12, this is the second question. How can God use wicked nations to do his will? And notice that section begins with a question. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord? And then we saw the wickedness of the Babylonians described in their violent conquest. There's a reference there to the Babylonian idolatry in verse 16. And finally, that section ends with the question, will they slay without sparing? Then we came to that bridge where we saw the statement made that the just will live by faith. How can God use the wicked nations? The answer now is given in those 5 woes. And in those 5 woes, and I'm not going to go through every woe again, we already did that, but I want you to notice a correspondence with some of the things that we saw in verses 12 through 17. We started with a question, are you not from everlasting, O Lord? Now the question is, will they not take up a taunt song? But again, it begins with a question. We saw the wickedness of the Babylonians in their violent conquest. Again, we see exactly the same thing depicted, the wickedness of the Babylonians in their violent conquest. We saw the Babylonian idolatry. There's another reference again to Babylonian idolatry in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. And notice this section ended with a question. This time it ends with an answer. The question had been, will they slay without sparing? And the answer is that the Lord in his holy temple, the Lord is in his holy temple. He's going to act, let all the earth be silent. No more questions. I've answered the questions. I am going to rule from my temple, not just my temple in Jerusalem. You see, the temple in Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, but God's holy temple is bigger than that. God's holy temple is a heavenly temple. All right, some lessons from Habakkuk's questions. First of all, we find that God balances his books, but he does it in his own time. Habakkuk is saying, I want justice, and you sort of read between the lines and you get the impression, and I want it right now. And yet sometimes there is a delay. God does everything perfectly. We see the same idea in the New Testament. 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about how a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. So don't take God's delay as a sign, as an indication that judgment and will not come, that God will not balance his books. He will, but he will do it in his own time. Secondly, when God balances his books, he does it in his own way. You see, again, Habakkuk is perhaps thinking, God can just come down and take care of this thing and that thing. And he's got the way perhaps he envisions, and we do the same thing. We say, Lord, I want the answer to my prayer, and can you do it this way, that way, and the other way? And the way God does it might be in a way that is very different from which we envisioned. Because when God balances his books, he does it in his own way. God balances his books without partiality. He does it with his people and with pagans like Nebuchadnezzar. And in the end, it will be a way that is just and righteous. But at the same time, God ultimately balanced his books upon the cross. You see, it was on the cross that we had the meeting of justice and mercy, where, yes, God showed mercy to all who believe, to all who trust in him, and yet the justice of God was answered because, frankly, we have all sinned. We've all fallen short of God's justice. And therefore we are all under condemnation and deserving of judgment. But at the cross, God poured out that judgment upon his son, who willingly, and this wasn't, he didn't say, I don't want to do that, and I rebel, but God's making me. No, Jesus actually prayed, not my will, but yours be done. So that he willingly went to the cross. Hebrews 12 says it this way, despising the shame, and yet for that which was, for the hope that was set before him, and you're the hope. It was to purchase you and I, those of us who have trusted in him. And so when we believe, we find that justice was answered on the cross, and we find that as a result, mercy is extended to those who believe.